Welcome back to our podcast. This episode is titled Unraveling the Revelation, Part 8. If you recall, in episode 1, I was explaining to Ron about the need for a 7-seal message that, according to the chart that I showed him, opened up in 1930. And he asked me what happened. Let me start this episode by saying that answers may vary. Depending on who you talk to, you may get a little bit of a wide variety of answers as to why there was a need for an additional seal in the timeline. I'm going to focus on 3 reasons, and then just briefly at the end of this episode mention others that you might hear should you ever ask that question to a 7-seal advocate. Today I want to talk to you about some controversies that took place a little bit prior to 1930 and even a little bit after that. The first one was education. More specifically, the beginning of the Anderson Bible Training School in 1917, which later then developed into the Liberal Arts College in 1925. The second controversy that I'd like to mention to you is the idea of organization within the church, and more specifically about the General Ministerial Assembly in 1917. And finally, I'd like to talk to you about race, or the color line that developed in 1917. First, let's look at Warner's early sentiments on education and training. This first quote can be found on page 59 of the book Birth of a Reformation by A.L. Byers. Brother Warner had the right view of ministerial qualification. He realized that in order to succeed, he must have the spiritual anointing, and that since it was God's work, it was needful that he be in that divine relation by which it would be God in him accomplishing the result. He held education to be very useful, and it was his endeavor throughout his life to add to his knowledge. But he regarded the spiritual qualification as paramount. In 1865 through 1866, D.S. Warner attended Oberlin College, enrolling in English Preparatory School. Now, this was the same school in which Charles Finney was the president. And in fact, he was the president during the time when Warner would have attended the college. I've often wondered if he had sat through any of Charles Finney's lectures and if he had ever found interest in what was being taught at that time. Later, Warner attended Vermilion College, where he studied Greek and New Testament. As a Winebrenner minister, Warner was appointed to plan a way to establish an institution of learning to be owned and controlled by the church. The result was the Churches of God General Conference's Seminary, Winebrenner Theological Seminary, which is now associated with the University of Findlay in Ohio. This part was established in 1882. Warner opposes formal education training, is our title of this next chart. After separating himself from sectism, or, as we have talked about, his coming out of denominationalism, Warner was opposed to formally educating ministers through seminaries. The following statements appeared in the Gospel Trumpet And they sort of typify the overall attitude towards education in the early days of the Church of God movement. This saying was said by G.B. Collins in the Gospel Trumpet, July the 11th, 1985 edition. The title of the section was Sayings from an Open Bible. A theological seminary is nothing more nor less than a so-called preacher factory. 2 Timothy 4, 1 through 4. It would be amusing to see a fresh Methodist or Baptist theological graduate trying to preach for and control a congregation of any other sect. They are not interchangeable. They will not fit. 1 Corinthians 1, 12 through 13. The second quote I would like to share with you was made by E.F. Houghton in the Gospel Trumpet, November the 1st, 1984. What does it take to be a preacher in Babylon? Let us notice. We must first be almost invariably, almost amicably, aristocratic, must be sharp, and slick-tongued. These are taken to a school or theological seminary and drilled and polished and so forth. While multitudes of souls are rushing through life unsaved and down to punishment. How different from the ministry of the Lord, who calls, qualifies, and sends. Oh, beloved, let us remember that God has power to prepare us for the ministry. And if he does not, all schools will not. But the person will be void of the power of God and a reproach to the work. And so you can see that all throughout the early years of the Church of God Reformation movement, there was this general idea of resisting training, particularly for ministers. Now, I've titled the next slide here, Warner Broadens His View. Let me read a few things for you. This first one again is from The Birth of Reformation, page 453. As time had passed, and soon before his death, Brother Warner changed his view and began making preparations for a training school on the grounds of the Grand Junction camp meeting. Here's the quote. By this time, a children's school has started on the campground near Grand Junction. He, speaking of Warner, took quite an interest in the school. Among the last things that engaged his mind was the arranging of a system of Bible study. It is evident that he had in mind some sort of training school, for he had planned courses in history, music, penmanship, and so forth, in addition to Bible study. So here it was believed that Warner might have been changing his views towards education. And in fact, there was some little school going on at the time of his death. And there were plans being made for some other kind of training school to be there as well. Immediately following his death in December 1895, E. Byram squelched the idea and announced in the Gospel Trumpet the following. I quote, "Some have asked if we have a theological school here. We answer, no. Neither do we expect to have. We have Bible readings and special faith meetings almost every evening, which are wonderfully blessed of God by way of spiritual advancement and real soul food. And holiness is lifted up to the Bible standard. This quote was made in the December 12th, 1895 edition of the Gospel Trumpet. For years to come, Byron's position towards education would be the standard of much of the movement, and in fact, it's pretty much still the standard of the Seven Seal ministry. I'm going to give you an example here, and this was not Byron. This quote I'm going to read here was by another brother, another minister by the name of John O'Blaney, and the title of the article is "Life and Light." It can be found in the Gospel Trumpet, January the 12th, 1899 issue. Quote, I can see plainly why God is calling, quote unquote, come out of her, my people, to his children in the man-organized systems of religion of today. He does not want them any longer under the contaminating influence of the blind, ignorant, quote unquote, dumb dogs who claim to be sent out by God to preach salvation to people, but cannot bark. Isaiah 56:10 and 11. Get Christ in you, and you will have life and light enough to show you the right way. Amen, he says, end quote. So despite the opposition to a training school by E. Byram, he ended up retiring as the second editor of the Gospel Trumpet Company and Gospel Trumpet paper, I should say. And in 1917, they opened up the Anderson Bible Training School there in Anderson, Indiana. But it certainly was not without its own share of controversy. Of course, E. Byram, who had now been the former editor of the paper, he resisted it, he opposed it, and so did F. Smith, the current editor at that time. F. Smith actually replaced E. Byram as the editor. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about this. We don't have the time to do that. But I can tell you that you can read more about a controversy or attempt to intervene with regard to the training school that occurred in 1923 in the book titled The Early Morning Light by Robert Reardon. So there were some things that developed and there was an attempt to intercede. But I do want to talk a little bit about the controversy that occurred in 1929. So, there had been some issues that had been brought forth, and they involved R. Byram, which was E. Byram's nephew. There were some accusations made about doctrinal things that was being taught there. And so there ended up being what became known in those days as the week-long trial. It was kind of hush-hush, but it took place in 1929 in the basement of Park Place Church there in Anderson, Indiana. And this trial was overseen by 14 leading, quote-unquote, thinking ministers. R. Byram, who at that time was the vice president of the school, was charged with heresy by R.L. Berry. And specifically, the doctrinal issues in which he charged him heresy was along the line of unity, sanctification, and kingdom theology. After all the evidence was heard and both sides represented, R. Byram was exonerated. But he was so hurt and discouraged at what had happened that he resigned that same night that he was exonerated. In 1930, F. Smith was voted out at the Gospel Trumpet as the editor, and C. Brown replaced him. Now, C.E. Brown was a much more progressive thinker and viewed as a more moderate leader. So, also, shortly after, Anderson Bible Training School was renamed Anderson College and Theological Seminary. But wait, there's more. In 1933, the college debate climaxed. F.G. Smith and Charles E. Byers, whose picture you saw in a couple previous slides, they led the way, and they were both from Ohio. And in fact, there was a meeting held in Springfield, Ohio, where I grew up, and they drafted a resolution. It was dated September the 2nd, 1933, and it listed the following issues. It said that there were textbooks that contradicted standard Bible doctrine that were being used at the school. There were non-theological courses that were causing friction in the ministry. And there was an accusation that no school had propagated the full gospel of the Church of God. In other words, that at what was originally set up to be an advocate of the Church of God gospel, that now, with everything that was happening, the Church of God had no school that was actually proposing or a proponent of the quote-unquote full gospel. Later on that year, up in Toledo, Ohio, another resolution was developed, and it was much stronger than the first one. In this case, number one, they said, we want to close the school. Number two, we want to replace the current administration. And number three, we want to start all over. Well, this resolution came to a head and was voted on in June of 1934. And the motion to remove the college president failed by a 12-vote margin, or by 243 votes against 231. So at that point, that was pretty much the last effort to try to curtail the things that was happening at the college. And so it went forward, and there was a lot of students that went through the college. Okay, I want to read to you on this next chart a quote by Walter S. Goodnight. And we're going to have quite a bit to say about him very soon. So this is what he had to say, and at this point, this is about 1933. Unless light comes through the highly educated, it is generally speaking cast down. If some little saint of God is given light on the Word, he has a hard time to get it wedged in as truth over the DDs and the LLDs of this present age. It is hard for the uneducated ministry to find openings among those that are looking for the highly educated for truth. And the majority of the present age are set on education above salvation. Education is good and necessary, but God sometimes calls uneducated into his service, and as it is coming to be at this age, they have a hard time to fill their calling. And so the issue that was highly contested at that time was involving the school and the kind of students students and then ultimately workers in the church that were being developed at that school. They tended to be more on the liberal side or progressive side than some of the conservatives. And so as they were being placed throughout the church, it was having an effect on the overall environment of the church. And so that became a major issue, at least for a good number of the ministers, conservative ministers. The second issue was on organization. Now, in 1917, June 28th, there's an article in the Gospel Trumpet, and it's actually titled "The Anderson Camp Meeting." Excuse me. And I don't have time to read the whole article, but I just cut out a couple paragraphs here, and I'm going to attempt to read this. As you can see, it's not very clear. The copy that I have of that Gospel Trumpet was not clear. So let me try to read this. The business interests of the church are receiving more careful attention than ever before. The Lord has given the ministry a larger vision of our unparalleled opportunities for spreading the pure gospel to the ends of the earth. A deep desire is manifested to see a great forward movement along every line of activity in gospel work, both in the homeland and in foreign fields. Our vision is not localized, but worldwide in its scope and purpose. In order to ensure a sound financial basis for these increased activities, better business methods are being considered for the future than we have been accustomed to in times past. It has also been felt for some time that there should be a more direct legal relationship existing between the publishing work and the general body of the ministry. Steps have been taken to place this great work in more immediate touch with the ministry and thereby to increase their responsibility for and their interest in this important phase of gospel work. New members have been added to the Gospel Trumpet Company, increasing the number to 24. These 24 names were ratified by a vote of the ministers in session at the present camp meeting. A more detailed report will be given in a later issue. So with this announcement, this ended up being they ended up forming in a formal way and organizing the General Assembly of the Church of God Reformation Movement. So let me back up a little bit. The first, and I'm going to put this in quotes, assembly of the likely was one convened informally in 1902 at the Yellow Lake Camp Meeting in Indiana, and the purpose of that meeting was to appoint one of the brethren to represent the whole ministry in talks with the railroads, more specifically in regarding special clergy rates. So there was a lot of traveling going on at that time, and if they were organized and they had names and so forth, they would get a discount on the railroads. And so that was why they had that assembly meeting. Well, as we've already read now, as things began to grow and there was works happening, not only in the United States but in foreign fields, they felt the need to formalize that kind of an assembly. And so that's when they created the General Assembly of the Church of God in 1917. And E.A. Reardon was elected as the founding chair. So as part of this General Assembly, it was legally incorporated as a nonprofit organization and empowered to hold property. Now, it organized only as necessary to function effectively and only the work of the church, never the church itself. The Gospel Trumpet Company voluntarily submitted its slate of nominees for membership, ending its self-perpetuating nature and delegating decision-making responsibility away from the gospel editor or the Gospel Trumpet editor and some of the staff there, and delegate that responsibility to a larger group of ministers, specifically this General Assembly. So, as we have talked about, the movement began as a resistance to human organizing of the church, with things like headquarters and boards and committees. And so setting up a assembly like this, some felt it was a risk because it could take the rightful place of God's Spirit, the leading of God's Spirit, and put it in the hands of men. And this caused great concern for many ministers. And that was not without its justification. This chart here shows what the assembly looks like today. So there's the General Assembly. Then there's something called the Ministries Council. They now have a General Director. And this really isn't a whole lot different than like D.S. Warner would have been, the position that he held, or with his gifting. E.E. Byram, F.G. Smith, kind of these people that were editors of the Gospel Trumpet magazine. They had a lot of authority, and pretty much the buck stopped with them when there would be issues. And so, and that worked out well whenever there was somebody in there that they liked, and they felt like was doing a good job. But if they didn't appreciate that individual and things that the positions they might have taken, then that would now fall into the hands of other folks, a body of ministers, and they would have a say-so. So that could, that would involve things like doctrine or the positions of the church, or, major decisions. And so now that individual is elected every so many years, and then I think they also ratify them every so many years. And they play a very central role in the working of the Church of God over in Anderson, Indiana. So they work with the endorsed agencies, they work with the affiliated agencies, and you can see some of those here on the chart. It would be the colleges and some cooperating relationships between the Children of Promise and Christian Women Connection. And then there's other partners in ministry, such as the American Council, Indian Council of the Church of God, the Hispanic Council of the Church of God, and the National Association of the Church of God. So, indeed, this General Assembly did open the door to more committees, boards, and now some people, at least outside of the movement, would even refer to Anderson, Indiana as the headquarters. And so that was a controversial issue back in those days, the things that were happening. They felt like it was infringing upon the role of the Holy Spirit in directing the church. This next issue is race. And I have quite a few slides here. I did try to consolidate them. In the future, I plan to do a podcast on race relationships in the Church of God. So I've really kind of condensed this. So you can look. You can, if you're interested, you can look at those the episodes whenever when I get those posted. So we talked about E.E. Byram several times. He was converted at 15. He was sanctified at 25. He was a co-editor of the Gospel Trumpet paper in 1887, and then became the editor upon Warner's death from 1895 to 1916. He was well respected within the Church of God, well respected. He did some tours, worldwide tour in 1904, took some missionary trips in 1909, 1926, and 1927. Brother Byram, and this is what most people would probably refer to when they think about him, he was given the gift of healing. And after 1916, after serving as the editor, he traveled extensively across the country praying for the sick. And as the books will record, he witnessed healings of thousands and even the raising of the dead. And these are documented in some of the history books of the Church of God. He was the author of 17 books, and again, he became the de facto leader of the Church of God movement after Warner's death. So very central to the Church of God movement at that time. Okay, in 1897, this is 2 years after Warner passed away, he wrote a book, or he wrote an article in the Gospel Trumpet paper called the Color Line Article. And you can find that, again, in the September the 2nd, 1897 issue. Okay, as you may have known, the Church of God in the early years was a very diverse church. It would go, white leaders would go down south, and they would have assembly meetings with both black and white together in the same location. And as you can imagine, that was not accepted. In fact, in some places, it was against the law. And so things were going very, very much. I mean, they were an example to everybody to follow. But things began to change. And so in this article, it basically concludes the following. We believe it would be better if it were convenient to have it so, that they, speaking of the saints, meet in separate meetings. Now, but there are places where it's almost necessary for them to meet together, and they do so in many places, meet harmoniously and to the glory of God. So he was basically saying there's a lot of racial tension going on across the country, and some places it's not an issue. In fact, some places there's not even facilities for blacks and whites to meet separately, so they should continue to meet together. But in other places, it would be better if and more convenient if they would meet in separate meetings. We do not believe in white and colored people mixing in marriage, or in any way that it is unnecessary. So they took a stand on interracial marriage in this article. We do not require the white brethren to greet the colored brethren with a holy kiss. If they feel it a duty according to the word of God, let them fulfill the word, and God will get the glory. So I don't know if you know, but back in those days they had a practice of the brethren would greet each other with a holy kiss. And so here he was saying, we're not making a requirement for the white brethren to greet the black brethren with a holy kiss. Now, if they feel like they should, let them fulfill the word and let God get all the glory. So as you can see, this is just a picture here of something developing within the Church of God that was different than the earlier days. And since it came from E. Byram, it served really as a guiding principle for future racial interactions. In 1908, the Gospel Trumpet began making a distinction in the meetings and their announcements. So they would have an announcement here in the state of Mississippi. This meeting, it's for colored people. Here in Missouri, this one is for the white folks. This one's for the black folks. In Texas, So they started making distinctions in their meetings, and what naturally became of that was the black people gathered at this place and the white people gathered at this place. And so it basically helped serve or set up a split among the races within the Church of God. And as you know, the key message of the Church of God has been from the very beginning of people's being equal and united together in one body. Okay, so Byram went on to explain, and I'll read this meeting notice here. This is what it says. These must reach us, if you're going to send an announcement in other words, these must reach us no later than Friday of the week preceding their publication. If far in advance, let notice give merely the place, date, and name of the person to address. Send full particulars later as it is published in 1 or 2 issues before the meeting. Avoid as much as possible changing the date of the meeting after it is once published. and as a general statement that will apply to all meetings, would say that the saints at different places are accustomed to meet at the trains, those coming from a distance, in other words, identify who would pick them up, if notified to do so, and as far as practical, to provide for the comfort of all. Provide yourselves with bedding and care for yourselves as far as possible. Provisions can usually be procured at reasonable rates. In no case are there gate fees or charges for admission. Invitation is extended to all. And then the last line of that notification says this: if meeting is for the benefit of colored people, please have notice contain the word colored. Okay? Well, the next step then, and this is what happened in 1917, in the yearbook, it started noting the difference in the races, or indicating the difference in the races. And so it would list, in case you're not familiar with the yearbook was kind of their means of identifying which ministers and congregations were working with the movement. And so they would, on a yearly basis, they would send in their information about the pastor, the evangelist, the minister, and then also about the congregation. And for the first time then, they required them to identify themselves in this yearbook here according to their race. And they practiced that until clear up to 1957. Okay, now let's bring this a little bit closer to home here. Let's talk about what was going on in Indiana, and specifically as it relates to the KKK. In 1915, the KKK, Ku Klux Klan, organized the Indiana Klan. And at its peak in the 1920s, the Klan counted among its members the governor of Indiana, more than half of the state legislature, and an estimated 30% of all native-born white Protestant men that lived in Indiana. So politicians, they learned that they needed the KKK's endorsement to win office because there were so many of them in that state. And they had infiltrated the politics, the political environment. They say that more than 250,000 Indianians, or residents of Indiana, were members of the Klan. Some because they believed in its anti-black, anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic, and anti-Catholic message. In fact, the Grand Dragon of the KKK lived in Indiana and eventually ran the largest Klan organization in the country. So there was a lot of influence there. There's a lot of things happening there in Indiana. This next chart shows where some of the most populated counties were at, and they show them in dark blue. And dark blue being that about 25% of the people in that particular county were members of the KKK. And so you can see in Madison County, which is the county where Anderson, Indiana is located, it was one of those counties with a large population of KKK members. Here's a picture of the KKK in Muncie, Indiana, 1922. So this became commonplace up there. There's a lot of racial tension in the state of Indiana. So now the segregation officially begins in the Church of God. Let's talk about that. In 1913, according to the minutes of the Camp Meeting Committee, and those are specifically June 15th, E. Byram suggested to the committee that, and quote unquote, it would be good to let the colored brethren have a meeting in the German tent after the German meeting in the afternoon. What he meant by that was the German-speaking people would have their own meeting, but it was on the basis of the fact that they were speaking German. So they felt it would be good for them to have an all German, speaking meeting there during the camp meeting. But he says as soon as they're done, then it would be good to let the Southern brethren, they can have their own meeting. So this proposal was accepted by the white leaders, but when it was presented to the black leaders, they rejected it. And they were concerned about, at least at a minimum, the perception of a division within the body of Christ. They did not support that. In 1914, camp meeting officials were still discussing the possibility of having a colored service aimed at evangelizing blacks who lived in the Anderson area but stayed away from the Church of God campgrounds. Such a service was tried that year as an experiment, but we have no record as to whether or not it was successful or if it was ever repeated again. However, with all of this discussion, everything that was happening, a separation of the blacks and whites, it eventually resulted in the blacks among the black saints among the Church of God having their first camp meeting in 1917. And they said that at that first camp meeting, this is not a picture of it, I don't believe. It is a picture of the camp meeting there at some point. But they said there was 600 people in attendance on that final Sunday. So they organized themselves in, as first known as the Gospel Industrial Association of the Church of God of the Evening Light Saints, and in 1943 then they changed the name and became known as the National Association of the Church of God. And that's still what they're called today. In fact, commonly they refer to that campgrounds there as Zion's Hill. Now you can read more information there at that link. You can just pause the podcast and write that down if you want to, but it tells you the history in detail. So, this was an issue. This was a concern to many people. This is not the message of the Church of God as it was originally founded or as it became into existence. Now there's a racial component to it. And sadly, that is still pretty much the way it is today. Most of your congregations are going to be all white, or they're going to be, here in the United States at least, all white or all black, or in some cases about all brown. Your Hispanics and so forth. There's not a lot of integration in the Church of God, certainly not like it should be. Okay. I said I would conclude this with a discussion about other issues that were developing at that time. And so one of them was the issue of tongues. Actually, the Azusa Street, a revival that took place out in Los Angeles, California in the early 1900s, it was headed up by a black brother that had been associated with the Church of God Evening Light movement. He had been exposed to the teaching of, salvation, holiness, and then added on the tongues, and it sparked a worldwide revival. While the effect of that revival, it had effects on pretty much all the denominations, and it also had an effect within the Church of God. And so there was a debate, and at one time, there were people that were pretty much speaking in tongues within the Church of God Reformation movement. And had at least one pretty prominent leader teaching that, for instance, you can pray in tongues as a private prayer language, and so that was taught and even put in one of the books. That was an issue. The use of musical instruments. Some people might say that was a big issue. They started playing music and singing the songs with musical instruments. Some people would say, well, it was all about the letting down of dress standards, or the changing of dress standards, or the fact that the Church of God began a partnership with other ecumenical bodies, such as the Federated Association of Churches, or which ended up being the World Council of Churches. So there was a number of issues that came up like these, and a lot of changes that were taking place, and it caused ministers, especially the older ministers, the ministers that had been conservative and been very zealous for the cause of the Church of God, it caused them to be concerned and to be restless. So we've talked about what happened up until the 30s and a little bit into the 30s, but the 1940s would see the largest numerical split to have taken place in the Church of God Reformation. And it was this split that really brought a more general acceptance to the seventh seal message. With that, I'm going to conclude this episode, and our next podcast we'll be talking more about the seventh seal message.